breaking international law merely by passing a binding resolution. Now, I see that we will come out of Copenhagen by Mr. Romero's approach to maintaining a grand status quo in which we all go into oblivion quite simply and safely. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. José, well, that's directly aimed at you, so yes. No one else is going to help you on that one.
I think that I have to precise a little bit. If Romero's approach would be endorsed by all countries, Romero representing here the Swiss government, every country would commit to at least to 20% and possibly till 30% of reductions in the period till 2020 compared to 1990 levels. This would be the commitment if everybody would follow Romero's approach. Okay, point one. If Romero's approach representing the Swiss position would be followed, we will install a global levy, $1, at least $1 per ton emitted of CO2 equivalent in order to collect $50 billion per year in order to be redistributed preferentially to developing countries for adaptation and technology. Understand me well. The point is that mitigation is something which is already running in developing countries, in developed countries, and the lapsus is interesting because developing countries are also doing a lot. We know that. Look at the reports of the World Resource Institute where they assess what China, India, Mexico, Brazil are doing, and they are doing a lot. So mitigation is on the way. What we need is to strengthen that. And what I say is that this strengthening will need some architecture which provides, and let's be clear, for some ways to deliver in finance, in technology, in cooperation, in order to mobilize all the potentialities that are not only in developed countries but also in developing countries. So I insist very much in that the central discussion has to be around the architecture in order to involve everybody. And reduction targets from developed countries are already there, we know that. Halldor said that the figures may not be so as expected, and he said, well, we may be somehow disappointed, but action is there. So, understand me well, without a good agreement on how to work together, which means also cooperation and so on, and who does what in terms of reduction, taking the lead and so on. Without that, it would be very difficult because you simply blow up the international system and then you have bottom-up approaches, everyone saying what he intends to do. And what we need is to have an international regime that is requesting from everyone what he has to do. So this is the point. The architecture, envelop everything under this word, is the agreement we need saying how we work together and what has to be done by each of us. Understand me well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take a question then.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Roger Martin. I'm from the Optimum Population Trust, but I'm also an ex-diplomat, and I have two questions. One about peak oil and carbon taxes, as well as about population policy. Can I ask them both?
Sure.
Thank you. The one about peak oil and carbon tax is that peak oil is upon us and will certainly put the price of carbon a great deal higher over the long to medium term. And it's in our interest, on the climate change point of view, that this should happen, because it will reduce emissions through market forces. So, and what we need is, however, that it moves upward in a predictable and smooth line rather than chaotically, which is what's happened recently. Could you envisage a negotiation on carbon tax, which, as a diplomat, knowing that treasuries love to disguise additional taxes as something else, as a green measure, a predicted long or to medium term price for oil, which would consist of great increases in carbon taxes when the market price dropped below, and of course the payment of some of that back into knocking off the peaks when it didn't, because it'll jiggle around. That's question number one. Question number two is about Copenhagen and the investment of the very large sums which are expected to be committed one way or another at Copenhagen or later towards things like new technologies. Now, we've done some preliminary research in the Optimum Population Trust, and knowing how treasurers like to save costs and also dress up the same pot of money as two different things, so it's cheap. We have done some research which demonstrates superficially, but not with real numbers, that there would be a colossal cost benefit to investing some of the money expected to be committed at Copenhagen into reducing the 43% of unwanted pregnancies which take place in the world, which cause great suffering to the poorest women, and who are longing to be empowered to control their own fertility, in which case they would reduce their fertility, as has happened already, where in Thailand, for instance, or Kerala, as was mentioned this morning. Now, given that, as Barbara Stocking and Margaret Chan admitted this morning in the plenary to my question, that they could not see a single question that this conference addresses which would not be easier to solve with fewer people and gets harder and ultimately impossible with more, then it seems to me that the notion of investing some of that money in the population female empowerment family planning programs that Margaret Chan wants to prioritize next year anyway would be a very good way of taking the numbers by 2050 down from the US median projection of 9.5 or 9.2 billion to the bottom end of the UN projection, which is 7.2 billion, which is a saving of 2 billion additional people and their descendants who were unwanted in the first place but would have to be supplied with energy and would produce a carbon footprint.
Okay, thank you
this
very
would
much.
Be a huge saving.
Let's tackle both of them. Paul, you wanted to tackle the first one, I think.
I'll
find a volunteer for the second.
I've already forgotten. The first one was...
About a carbon tax.
Carbon tax. There is almost no possibility in the short run that governments will negotiate harmonized carbon taxes. However, in the longer run, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and once we make some progress, that might happen. Things are much more complicated than the price of oil. One of the problems, obviously, is that as oil runs out, there's a temptation to go to other fossil fuel subsidies. So, in fact, you need a carbon tax and not an oil tax, which makes it, in some ways, more complicated, in some ways less complicated. Very briefly, on the other problem, it seems unlikely that the climate negotiations will want to take on board problems of population because they're very divisive politically. On the other hand, your points are well taken. It is not inconceivable that countries who are now talking about sectoral CDM and policy CDM and ways of getting carbon credits for policy investments, it is not inconceivable and not dumb that you might actually get some kind of credit for population policies. I think it's a bit of a stretch, but if you can think about that the idea is any policy which reduces emissions on the long term in some ways could be credited, why not these kinds of policies?
Did you just make that up, or is that actually an idea you're working on?
I just made it up.
You just made it up? Well, it's interesting. Who else wants to pick that
yes,
up?
Okay, I'll comment on the following. And I'm not an economist, so I feel free to be probably exploring more creative avenues. The proposal we do for what I mentioned as a carbon tax is, of course, a very tiny component. It's not a deterrent, if you wish. It's just a money pump, because we have to assure somehow predictable, sufficient levels of financing. But I believe you that we may envisage a number of efficient investments. And while the convention and the protocol work like strategic places, giving signals, providing parties with the opportunity to think about establishing frameworks for redirecting investment, promoting renewables, for example, and so on.